A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very good Tuesday afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much, actually, for joining us for ICDM PowerTalk series, the online edition. Well, of course, we are all sheltering in place at the moment. We're keeping safe, we're keeping at home. But thank you very, very much for actually joining us this afternoon for this series. It's actually the second for the year. But so in that case, aside from our presentation, we will also be having a panel discussion at the end of this. But before we even go into that, just a bit of housekeeping rules. As you've noticed, your mic is automatically muted, as is your video. But don't worry, if you want to contact us, there's ways of doing that. The Zoom tab at the bottom has two tabs. There is the Q&A and there's one for chat. If you have any questions, please type it into the Q&A tab and we'll answer them at the end of the panel discussion. So there's going to be a panel discussion before Q&A. If you're having any technical difficulties though, or if you have any questions, you want to give us any feedback or recommendations, please feel free to drop us in the chat box just to the side, hopefully. This whole session is recorded. We'll send you a copy of it after. And if you wish to leave the webinar session at any time, you can, but you can rejoin if it is still in progress. Before we go on, let me introduce our speaker today, who's James McCulloch, who's Chief Executive, Inspire Group Asia for New Zealand. Topic for today is Path to the Next Normal, so what now for leadership? Things change. They change day to day at this moment, and that's not an understatement in the world that we're currently live in. We've heard so much, I think, over the past couple of weeks about how old strategies fall away in the face of this once in a generation, almost cataclysmic event. I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying I don't think anything will be the same after this. Oil, for the first time in history, crashed to below zero, and that's for West Texas Instrument. And it's just one of the other unfortunate milestones of the times that we live in. So in that case, and taking all of that in, so what then becomes important to us as leaders, and what becomes important to us as workers? And for that, I hand it over to James to maybe answer some of that. Over to you.
Nadia, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody, or good evening from here in New Zealand, where I am. I'm just outside Wellington, for those of you who know New Zealand a little bit, and just going to share my screen now there. And I just wanted to start by saying a huge thank you, actually, and there's two thank yous. Thank you, of course, to ICDM for hosting this, and in ordinary circumstances, when we first discussed this, I would have been there with you in person. You know, remember those wonderful days when we used to actually gather in rooms together and have networking and sharing? Well, you know, we're going to explore that a little bit today, but I'm sure some aspect of those days will come back again. But what you've also done is you've paused, and I appreciate that. You've paused from whatever you're dealing with this afternoon, and whatever business you're dealing with, both in Malaysia, the region, or wherever you are in the world. I know there's some of you joining from all over the world. We're all going through some quite interesting times, and there's no doubt about that. And, you know, Inspire Group Asia, you know, you can connect with us and you can see what we've been doing as well. Do connect with me on LinkedIn. There's lots of resources that we share about how to deal with these times. But let's be under no illusions. We're not just working from home. We are at home, we're in a crisis, and we're just trying to get work done. So the first thing I want you to think about is the fact that all of your team, and in fact all of you as well, your family, your friends, your colleagues, are all dealing with this in different ways. You are balancing family, friendships, life, children, childcare, cooking, all of those different things that in ordinary circumstances are quite challenging, but not all at once. And usually when we have to work at home, we do that because we choose to work at home. We want to get things done. We want to focus on something. This isn't like that at all. We are trying to get things done at home as well. So I want to make that very important distinction first of all. And thank you again for pausing from that balance that you find yourself on as well. We're going to explore quite a few things. The thing that keeps me very interested about these times is the link between leadership and well-being. Now, leadership and well-being have been linked, right, you know, since the beginning of time, but right now they are incredibly critical. You know, we need excellent leadership and we need a real focus on well-being at the moment as well. The communication that we have as leaders in our boards, in our companies, in our NGOs, and our SMEs, wherever you want to be leading, is incredibly important. There's got to be a bit of transparency about that and clarity, but real empathy as well. Remember what I was just saying about all of those balances that we're trying to have in our lives. And I'm going to come back to that and give you a bit of a New Zealand perspective. And there we go. You know, what we've seen in New Zealand is perhaps a slightly different approach. And, you know, how do you change the behavior of not just a team or an organization, but in fact, a whole nation overnight? And there's some critical success factors there, which I'll share with you as well. Now, out of necessity, we've moved into this digital era. Now, this is something that some companies have been playing with for a little while. Some have been leading the way. Others have been perhaps holding back. And almost overnight, in lockdown, in MCO, whatever we call it, wherever we are in the world, we've had to do that out of necessity. And that's been both incredibly liberating, challenging for some people, but also presents some great opportunities as well. Now, more than ever, I believe that leadership and learning need to be simplified as well. They're vastly overcomplicated. I'm going to show you why. I don't think anyone this afternoon is looking for any more complexity in their lives, so let's strip that away straight away. And also, just to wrap up, you know, we have this new business model that's kind of been thrust on us, and this new way of working. So what on earth do we do with it now? And this isn't a talk, by the way, about how we survive in the COVID era or how we adapt within MCO. We need to look way beyond that into the future and what we need to be doing now as leaders to really thrive in those times. Now, if we were together, I would be asking you now if there was any leaders in the room, and I bet, as I do these talks all over the world, there would be a sort of smattering of hands. Some people would say, yes, I'm a director, or I'm a CEO. Some people would say, well, I'm not sure, I lead projects, does that count? Let me make that very clear to everyone. We're all leaders. Everyone on this call is a leader. A leader is simply anyone with any degree of influence over somebody else. You're a leader because you've chosen to be on this call. You're a leader because I hope that you will share some of the content and insights that you receive on this call as well. Now, what I rarely do at the beginning of these talks is a thing that I really don't like, which is to throw up so-called inspiring images of leaders from the past. You'll recognize many of these faces have gone up here. But the reason I wanted to share these particular individuals is all of them faced a crisis in their nation, in what they were doing, and all of them very cleverly looked beyond that crisis to what is the next normal. And of course, they adapted and they were able to thrive in those environments as well. But just for a bit of fun as well, I would say that anyone who throws images of inspiring leaders up at the beginning of talks, Google the anti-myths of great leaders. And the anti-myths of great leaders will show you that each one of these individuals was also flawed, like all of us. We're all not perfect. So don't believe anyone that throws these images up and tells you these leaders were perfect. They weren't, but they did actually look beyond the current crisis to what was next. Now, the other thing to remember is that the speed and the thoughtfulness, I'll come back to that, with which businesses respond in this crisis will determine their future. Now, anyone can be fast, but thoughtfulness is about culture. Thoughtfulness is about engaging the team. Thoughtfulness is about collaboration. Thoughtfulness is about mindset. And that's something I need you to really focus on in these times, because that will make the difference. And if we want some proof of that, I'll simply share a couple of numbers with you. We know, the Fortune 500. And if I told you that the Fortune 500 from 20 years ago, only 47% of those companies still exist and still thrive. The reason the other 53% ceased to exist was they ceased to be relevant and they ceased to be respected. And that's the trick at the moment in any times of crisis. Now, in ordinary times, what keeps leaders, CEOs, directors up at night? These things do. And, if you look at these, about 60 to 70% of these things are people related. If we were to put a COVID-19 or an MCO lens across this, it would be the same sort of numbers. It would be people related things, but it becomes much more immediate. And I was saying, to a couple of clients this week that in ordinary times, we have so much more time to get used to these things. We have time to reflect. We perhaps have a vacation and we reflect on these things and we come back and we adjust. We're having to make those adjustments many, many times in a day at the moment. And just as we've got used to that, and what we have to adapt with our people or our companies, we have to do it all over again the next morning as the latest news breaks. So I would say we need to be kind to ourselves at this time as well as leaders, because we're taking this huge burden ourselves too. Now, a traditional formula that we're taught for any time, whether times of crisis or not, is that your talent or your return on investment or your productivity is simply a result of your skills and your experience. I'm going to share with you a little bit later why that's no longer true. The other thing I need you to think about is that really an outcome is determined by the event and the response. And there's some people that say, well, the outcome is just a sum of those two things. That's what I do. The really, really smart leaders at the moment are thinking about the outcome they want and letting that shape the response. The event is fixed at the moment. We can't do anything about that, but we can shape how we want to come out of this as leaders by thinking about the response that we take, the response about how we develop our leaders, the response about how we communicate as leaders at the moment, and the response in terms of how we show empathy for our teams. And I'm going to keep coming back to those three themes fairly shamelessly throughout this talk and in the panel discussion that follows as well. And the other important concept at the moment is this one, logic versus emotion. Now, let me just spend a moment unpacking this. Logic tells us that this is a crisis, and a crisis will always pass. Logic tells us that there will be a recession, and it may be quite deep, and there may be different shaped recoveries out of this. And logic tells us that actually everything probably will be okay in the end. Emotion tells us that it might not be. It might be terrible. My company might go under. We may never trade in the same way ever again. What if my customers never come back? What if, what if, what if? And the thing about emotion and the what if is we are conditioned as humans to play what if in the negative. Very rarely do we say, what if COVID-19, what if MCO, what if lockdown was the best thing that ever happened to my business? What if this was a turning point for how we worked? What if this was a turning point for the world? It's not very easy to do that, but I want you to try and think about that as well. Now, what are we hearing? Now, we're in this privileged position, I suppose, Inspire Group. We work all over the world, advising on leadership and culture and learning. And so we get to hear what's going on. And I suppose we're all bombarded with things through social media at the moment. What are we hearing? Well, the first thing we're hearing comes actually very close to home from ICDM. We're hearing about those skill sets that boards need at the moment and leaders need at the moment. And we're seeing what we love, which is a very simple infographic there on the left about what leaders need to be doing right now. And what I love about that, of course, communication is very high up there, but notice well-being, notice compassion on there as well. And again, I keep coming back to those terms because that will shape how successful you're going to be as a leader in this era and in the new normal beyond it as well. Harvard Business Review published a great report just a few days ago, thinking about what leaders should be spending their time doing right now as they're not balancing everything else in their lives. Certainly spending some time envisaging the future of your company. A strategy that how you work back from that future point to where you are right now. But you know what? Here's the real trick, is you need to be prepared to learn and you need to be prepared to pivot. And pivot used to be something that we would talk about, like disruption was a desirable thing within a business. We now know what that really means. We now know that that means changing our direction multiple times a day. And the hard thing, of course, because the secret to great leadership is just great communication, how do you rally your team around that vision when the vision is changing all the time and the reality and the environment they're working within is less than perfect? Now, the other one that I love, and I've just come across this in the last 24 hours, and I'm sure we'll find a way not only to share these slides, but to also share these reports as well through ICDM, is this concept of the new low-touch economy. Lowtoucheconomy.com, Board of Innovation out of the States. And a low-touch economy, in some senses, is here to stay. And what does that look like? Well, we've seen this in New Zealand, and we've seen this elsewhere in the world. The rules will swing up and down. And what I mean by that is we may come out of lockdown and we may go back. We may come out of MCO and see some sort of different restrictions. If you look at China and look at how they've opened up things only for some things to close a week later. when it was deemed unsafe or people didn't want to use them in that particular way. Some new habits will stick. There's no doubt about it. I think that people have discovered that it's pretty great not to have a commute every day, or it's pretty great to be able to balance their time with their family and spend a bit more time at home. But there will be, to use a term we're very familiar with in New Zealand, from a seismic point of view, there will be aftershocks. This will not be a straight line or a smooth recovery. There is no playbook for this one at all. And any new normal will not be easy, because if it was easy, we would have done it already. My personal view is that, this isn't going to be a change to the fundamentals. This will be an erosion around the edges. This will mean that the things that are fundamentally important to us as human beings, in terms of our work and our satisfaction and our well-being, will stay the same, but how we achieve those will be very different. We may expect to be less defined by what we do in the future, but how we do that. Perhaps more of a focus on the impact we make, not the effort. I don't believe that work is about how many hours you're sitting there at the desk being present in the office. It's about what difference you're actually making. Now, there's no doubt about it, and I'll share a few book recommendations as we go along. It's very tough at the moment. I love this quote from Deborah Alcott-Tyler. She was one of my mentors in London when I worked there, and so appropriate for these times. There will be tough times, but they make you determined to win against the odds. We all have tough times. That's just life. And why does that even matter? Why does leadership even matter at the moment? Well, some of you will have completed Gallup StrengthsFinder assessments in the past. There's 25 million different data sets that they now hold. And the CEO of Gallup, just a few months ago actually, made this very interesting quote, that the biggest decision you make is who you name as leader. And if you name the wrong person, nothing really fixes that. It doesn't matter whether the office environment is great or we have a brilliant culture. You know what? If the person you report to just isn't effective, that really impacts every area of your life. And if I ask you to think about worst job and best leader and worst leader, it wouldn't be long until you started to think about how that actually impacted not just your work, but your relationships, your friendships, your hobbies, exercise, nutrition, all of these different decisions we make because of whether we're experiencing good leadership or bad leadership. And that is the link between leadership and well-being in the new normal. And the biggest impact, of course, on health and happiness is the quality of your relationships. And think for a moment, back in those wonderful days when we went to go offices every day, even on a tough day, what was it that got you through? It was the social connection that you felt. It was the chance conversation with a colleague. It was the coffee. It was walking to the elevator and having just a little bit of a bit of fun or a bit of a debrief about a particular thing. And you know what? That is what we're desperately missing at the moment, and what we need to find in these new times and beyond them as well. And here's a particular poignant one from the Mayo Clinic in the States, that actually the person you report to at work, whether it's physically or in lockdown or remote working, is actually more important to your health than your family doctor. And there's no doubt about it. Work, leadership, where we spend 10,000 days of our lives has a massive impact on our health and our well-being. And there's a real problem with this, and this is why I don't believe we're very equipped to deal with this new reality. Actually, we haven't been generating great leaders. The world is not full of great leaders. DDI publishes research every year looking at all of the best leadership development and learning across the world, and only 35% of it really makes a difference. Back to Harvard again, only 7% is felt to make a real difference. And there's a reason for that. And if you think about leadership programs that you've sat on, where they may have transformed you for 2 or 3 days and inspired you, but after that, no difference, it's because it wasn't relevant to the challenges that you were facing. Future learning and development, future culture change has to be absolutely contextualized to your world and the problems that you're facing. Now, if you want a great deconstruction of this, another book recommendation, and I love this one, is this, Leadership BS, a complete deconstruction of the whole world of leadership culture and leadership models. I'm not a great believer in these things because I actually think that we become great leaders through practice and showing vulnerability and having great conversations. So do check that out if you want to really get that other side as well. On a more serious note, and way before the current crisis, Jeffrey Pfeffer wrote this other book, which is Dying for a Paycheck. And he talks here about the 130,000 people a year in the States that die from work-related stress. So I'm not talking here about injuries, I'm talking about illnesses caused by stress and by poor leadership. And, you know, the quote here on the screen, I think is very important in any times, that if we're honest with ourselves, there are people that we work with that we really, really like working with, in good times and in bad. And there are people, if we're honest, that we struggle with. They don't seem to have the same belief system as us, the same mindset. But you know what? Our job as leaders is not to send them home or back to their families when they disengage from their working at home. Don't send them back into those environments in worse shape than they turned up for in work. That's our role, okay? No matter how difficult they're being, very rarely are people doing that deliberately. There are all sorts of other things going on. And going back to that well-being piece, a great question I want to leave with you is, what's really going on here? Next time you're on a Zoom call, next time you're trying to have a catch-up with that team member who's not really engaging and sharing as much as they used to, what's really going on for them? Because I'll bet you that they've gone through all sorts of different challenges in that day already, perhaps with worries about family members elsewhere in the world, perhaps with children, perhaps with all sorts of different things, financial worries, whatever, the list goes on. What's really going on there? Now, more than ever, we need to simplify, because leadership is complicated, isn't it? Well, it must be. I've Googled it, I've checked, here you go, 32.7 million suggestions on what makes a great leader. And I can tell you there are not 32.7 million ways to be a great leader at all. We're also conditioned to think it's much more complicated now because of different generations. Gen X needs this, Gen Y, millennials need this. Yes, there is some nuance in how we communicate with different generations, there's no doubt about that. But if I was with you in person now, I'd ask for a show of hands for anyone who has children. And that would be most of us, right? Or any of us that have brothers and sisters. But the thing about it is, and I have two children, 11 and 13, and just in the next door room here, same upbringing, same environment, same generation, but completely different personality. And I want you to be really wary of these sweeping generalizations about what different generations need. Going to this new normal, we'll all need what we always needed: fairness, psychological safety, clarity, and making meaning of what we can do, and a role with purpose. And of course, our employees have evolved and will continue to evolve as well. So going back to that formula, it's not just the skills and experience which will shape how we thrive in the new normal. It is the attitude, it is the mindset, it is the culture of our workplaces. And guess what? That actually comes down to us as leaders to shape that. Now, I promised you simplicity, and I don't want to make things any more complicated, so let's just try and do that now. Another great book recommendation, it's a great book because it's a short book, is The One Thing. And The One Thing is a concept about prioritization and thinking, what is the one thing you can do so that everything else will be easier or unnecessary? Now, I can bet you that all of us on this call have a to-do list today. And I bet by the end of today, and we're already 4 hours ahead of you in New Zealand, so I can give you this prediction from the future, you won't get through that to-do list. There'll be things on there that you thought were critical for today as a leader that you will not get through. But if you spent some time at the beginning of that day thinking about, okay, I've got dozens of things to do, but what is the one thing I could do that would make a real difference for everything else? Now, as a leader, guess what? Those one things are often the most complicated and uncomfortable things we have to do. They are the difficult conversations. And the world and our companies are full of difficult conversations right now. There's no doubt about it. But by taking a breath and having them, what a difference we can make to those days as well. Another great book, written, of course, long before the current era, but very relevant right now, is How Do We Simplify Business Models to Strip Away Complexity and Scale? And again, I would really commend that book to you all. Now, thinking about all of that, here is what I believe and what Inspire Group believes makes great leaders. I guess our qualification for that is having done this for 20 years in 38 different countries, thousands and thousands of different leaders, from government to SMEs to corporates. What we see is that these three components make for a great leader. And we've tested this just in the last few weeks, thinking about this in the current era and the new normal as well. I think it stands the test. you need a growth mindset. You need the ability to see setbacks. I know life is full of setbacks at the moment, as simply a way not to do it next time. We need more than ever leaders who can lead themselves before they lead others. People who are proud of the balance in their lives and of sharing that with their colleagues as well. But if you want to just do one thing as a leader for the rest of today, focus on this red circle. Great leaders only do two things. They provide direction and they provide inspiration. And if you think of the best leaders that you've encountered, even in the last few days, I bet they did both those things. But I bet they actually balanced between them. They provided you with a clear direction, but they inspired you to take that course of action as well. And let me tell you, there's nothing worse than a leader who just does one of those things. Clear direction is not particularly inspiring. And worse still is lots of inspiration, but when you don't have a clue what to do with all that energy and enthusiasm. Now, more than ever, of course, we need to have a growth mindset in this. It's a well-trodden expression, and there are lots of different models and theories we can use around it, but simply this, it's just to embrace those challenges and to keep going and persist at the moment. And we're going to have to really persist for many more months and beyond, there's no doubt about that. And also perhaps using this bit of framing as yourself, as a leader, but also with your team as well. We're going to have to try things that will fail. There's no doubt about that. And we're going to have to embrace that and not be afraid of that failure. Because the change we have to adopt is even harder. There you go. Look at all those results for the best change strategy. Now, we all know about the change curve. I'm sure we've seen it. I actually prefer this representation of it. Here we go. You know, the anger and the grief and the upset, the acceptance, and moving through that in 1 minute. Now, in ordinary times, leaders and our teams, we go through change, but we have time, don't we? We use models like ADKAR, and we take time, and we probably have workshops. We haven't got that time at the moment. We are going through these cycles and these circles multiple times in a day. And if you felt a bit more tired recently, it's not just because of this constant staring at the screen and all Zoom calls, and perhaps the worry you may have about your business, it's because you're having to go through change and adapt multiple times a day. So, on a brighter note, and we're coming way beyond halftime now, how can we actually adapt and thrive in these times? Well, let me give you 3 or 4 key ingredients. The first one, more than ever, is that context matters hugely. So whether you are developing a new strategy, whether you are doing BCP, whether you are gathering your team for some sort of inspiring team session about how we get through the next crisis, the context matters hugely. You should only be talking about things that really, really impact your business. There are some great pieces of research out there so you can actually tune your response to your particular business and your sector. It's very easy to spend time on things that aren't productive at the moment to feel busy, but context and focus will matter hugely. The other thing as well is keeping it incredibly real. So any development you do at the moment, and I think development is more important than ever, has to be grounded in the reality of what your leaders are facing today. So if you're doing learning, if you're doing any sort of stimulations, if you're trying to rapidly upskill your leaders, you better make sure the examples they're working on are from your own company and they're about the crisis that you're facing right there and then. Mindset, as I've already described, crucial at the moment. And guess what? If you're having a good day or a bad day, or as I describe, a good hour or a bad hour, because I think our days move so fast at the moment, both of those things are absolutely fine. I think we need to be very kind to ourselves about the mindset that we find ourselves in, but finding, if we can, the positives from this situation as well. And there has to be an absolute shameless focus and obsession with results as well. What difference will these moves that we make as leaders right now and into the future really make in terms of results? And if you want to think about how we change behavior, of course, just think about this. You have to actually participate in that activity, and you have to believe that that will shift behavior for that to happen as well. So when we think about learning, and I described at the beginning how learning and development of your team is more important now than ever, how do you avoid being in that 65% of leadership development and learning that isn't effective. There was never any time for that in the past. There certainly isn't any time for that now. So what did you last learn and how? Because you're learning things all the time at the moment, faster than ever. And focusing on what you need now. We used to talk a lot about the future of work as if it was this strange thing a long way over there. Overnight, we had to embrace these things, even the organizations that weren't ready. Collaboration, teamwork, critical. Well-being, focusing on empathy, focusing on wellness, focusing on mindset. And how do you influence and collaborate with those people when they're not there with you? And we're all learning different techniques of doing that over the last few weeks, and we'll explore that more, I'm sure, through the Q&A as well. But I also want you to think about how we best consume this content and how we consume anything that's going to help us develop as leaders and our teams as well. More than ever, it has to be incredibly personal and relevant to us. All of the best learning and development now that we're seeing globally is portable. It comes through our phone. And snackable, this very strange concept. You know, at the moment, there's no time to disengage from the business and go off for a 3-day retreat, even if we could and we're allowed to. You need help with a particular challenge. You need it right there and then. You need things delivered through your phone that will give you the context and the content to help you get through that next hour or so. And what will that look like? Well, you know, here's some examples that we're seeing from the work that we're doing and others are doing as well. It will look exactly like this. In fact, this is an example for Australia Postal Service before this crisis. It gives this content in the hands of the people that need it. This is how leadership and learning needs to change and is changing. Doesn't this already look old-fashioned? This is how, of course, things changed in the past. And, you know, it's nice to believe that we'll come back together, but it just seemed odd looking at that sort of lack of social distancing at the moment. Of course, the reality of gathering together for group work or discussions or workshops is exactly this at the moment. We're all familiar with this, and we've all flipped very quickly to be able to do that, of course. But we need to keep people engaged, and we need to gamify more. And there's plenty of great examples of how you can take boring things like risk management and gamify and make them more attractive. We need to use things like animation and motion graphics to bring subjects to life. People have such a short attention span, and the biggest competitor to any form of learning that you want to get out to your team at the moment is not other forms of learning, it's the other things they want to look at on their phone. Facebook, maybe LinkedIn if you're lucky, certainly Instagram. So those things have amazing stickiness, and those things have amazing user experience. So whatever you're doing in that space has to be just as good, if not better, and that's the challenge. So if you're inducting and onboarding your staff virtually, it needs to be fun. It needs to be engaging. And if you're trying to teach safety when you can't gather people together, you need to be thinking about online simulations and how do you actually do this in a very smart way. Because working at home in the future, and it will stick, will not just be about giving people a laptop. It'll be about giving people the tools they need to fully do their new role from home or from wherever they are. And of course, giving them those tools in the pocket as well. Now, just to finish my part before we start to move on to the Q&A and panel, I want to share with you the other half of the story, because I've touched on well-being, I've touched on wellness, I've talked about empathy, and I don't want to understate that at all, because make no mistake, there is a clear link between where we spend 10,000 days of our lives and how we feel. And there's no doubt about it that well-being is the most important thing in the world. It impacts our mental health, our physical health, our relationships, how long we live. It absolutely runs through all of those different things. And quite simply, the leadership we experience has the biggest impact on that well-being. Now, where I live, and where I'm talking to you from right now is actually just at the sort of top right of that picture, just outside Wellington, New Zealand. And people have a view about New Zealand that they've either been there or they like to go there. It's a wonderful place. We're blessed at the moment to have the space that we have and be as isolated as we are in the world. But let me share with you another side of life in New Zealand. New Zealand has a challenge, many challenges all over the world, but a particular challenge with this, with teen suicide. And with isolation in communities and all sorts of complicated reasons for that. But what it means is that New Zealand's had to get pretty good at conversations and difficult conversations. And the secret to well-being, of course, is having those challenging conversations. And often we get called into organizations who want to get better at mental health and well-being. They perhaps have tried yoga, and guess what? It made no difference. They perhaps given free fruit, thinking that would make everyone happy and less stressed. It certainly helps a little bit, but it's not the answer. Or they've thrown around some beanbags and tried to make the office look a bit like Google or a startup, and they've found people just as stressed. Maybe they're just a bit more comfortably stressed. The answer to well-being, and here's a great New Zealand model around this for the Mental Health Foundation, is about noticing what's going on. Remember, what's really going on here? Learning, connecting, having those conversations. And remember back to that red circle, direct and inspire. How do leaders direct and inspire? They direct and inspire through conversation. What's the number one thing that people get frustrated about their leaders? And they will in the future just as much. It's they never have difficult conversations. The one thing that leaders get particularly anxious about, keeps them awake at night, is having difficult conversations. And let me tell you that a conversation about well-being or mental health is an incredibly challenging conversation to have. But we need to get better at that. And like anything, we get better through practice. So I want you to really think about that and do practice as well. And use very, very simple models. I only like using incredibly simple models because we do not need any more complexity in our lives at the moment. So applying that one thing lens across well-being, how do we make it simpler? How do we simplify? Well, it's simply this. The secret to well-being in work right now and in the new normal are these things. A role with purpose. A role that I would describe passes the kitchen table test. When you're back with your family, when you're re-engaging after working at home for the day, would you describe something about your day? Would you describe something that had made a difference? And if you're not at the moment, how can we use these times as an opportunity to shape that? How can we be thinking more about the impact people are making within our organizations and not just the effort and the hard work they're putting in? But that's not enough. The second one is critical, and that's the social connection. And again, if we've been feeling a little bit down or overwhelmed in recent weeks, it's because we're missing that social connection. We can't replicate that through having an uplifting Zoom call. We can't replicate that through phoning people always. It's just about that wonderful social connection, those chance encounters we had in our office spaces. And that's incredibly important. And we need to be thinking about that more and more in the world of work. So whether you're a digital or analog leader, and I'm hoping that you're all becoming rapidly digital leaders, there are those three core skills you need at the moment. Providing some clear direction, even though things change every single day. Having the difficult conversations and finding a way in these current very compromised times to collaborate, think, engage, and inspire. And just to finish as well, it's a shameless plug here for where I live in New Zealand, and I'm very, very proud of this, very proud of our response. We absolutely love our Prime Minister here. But whatever we might think about politics, there are three key components here that she's managed to do in changing the habit of a whole nation overnight, when we very quickly went into full lockdown with almost no warning at all. The first component is about giving clear direction. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And that making meaning is this is what it means for you. And the third is an acknowledgement. This will be difficult for all of you, but this is why we're doing it. Now, learning and leadership is about influence, and it's about changing behavior. So what I love about this example, and you can dig deeper on this one, I'm happy to share some links as well. We've posted a lot of this on Inspire Group Asia LinkedIn. It's behavior change. And what are we trying to do as leaders? We're trying to change behavior of our team. But this is a whole nation. So direction, making meaning, and empathy. And so above all, to conclude, what got us here will simply not get us there. We need to simplify that relationship between leadership and well-being. We need to strip away anything that's not of value. And we need to think a lot more about the impact that people make, because that, of course, is better for us as business leaders. But I tell you, for their well-being and for a role with purpose, it's a lot better for them as well. This is our chance now to erode what it is around the edges we don't like and go into this new normal as leaders, equipped perhaps to fail, perhaps to experiment, but to really take our teams and our businesses to a new normal where we don't just adapt, we actually thrive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, for actually, it was very uplifting. I find it very uplifting, and I think these days uplifting may be in short supply. So thanks a lot for all those words. We're actually going to move on now to our panel discussion before we do our Q&A. And for you to know, there's actually a whole bunch of questions, but we'll get to the panel first. And because of that, let me invite into this virtual space Frances Valentine, who's the founder, Tech Futures Lab, board member of Watercare and Dilworth, Futures Advisor to Bank of New Zealand. Please give her all a virtual warm welcome. I know you can't hear it, but I think we're all clapping for you, Frances. Hello, good afternoon, or good evening for you, actually.
It is evening here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're going to go straight into the panel discussion, and there's like a few questions that we have. Azzy, can we pull up the first one? So we have a few, but before we go on into the questions, I just want to say, James, I do hope a lot of companies and directors actually understand what you're putting across for empathy, because I feel that a lot of us are forgetting that because we're all so stressed, right? We're also panicked, we're worried about the future and how to go, and everybody is under pressure, whether you are the CEO or you're the lowest person on the vine. And I think what we're missing in a lot of spaces is people just telling each other that it's going to be okay. It's not going to be the same, but it might be okay. I think we're missing a lot of what you said is that human or the social connection. Because if you're a business leader, you agree with me or not, your workers can't function if there's a shadow over your head. Is that correct?
Yeah, look, I think absolutely. I think it's a difficult one. And look, to be quite open and honest with everyone on the call, I find that difficult myself as a business leader. We know we are we all have challenges, and obviously, our work has become, more challenging around the world as well. And at the same time, we're trying to be, very upbeat with our teams. But there is a reality to it as well. I think it's a very fine line between, not sugarcoating it too much in terms of this is the reality we're facing, but not also just giving doom and gloom every day. So it's, hey, this is a reality. This is what it means for you. But here's something that every single person can do about it to make it better. And
right.
I shared this example earlier today. I have a couple of friends who work for Air New Zealand, and that's a particularly relevant example in New Zealand. Like every airline, it's grounded at the moment. They can't really do much about their current issue. They're grounded. That's it. They can't just have more conversations and try and sell more flights. But I think in most of our businesses, we all can do something right now to perhaps impact our business in a positive way. So I think if we're working perhaps in smaller enterprises as well, there is something that every individual, whatever level they're at in the business, can do. So I think that's an important message. But you're quite right. I think it's, we need to be kind to ourselves as leaders, but also kind to those around us, because we'll be remembered for how we behaved right now.
Very much so. So the first question up is, of course, we heard a lot about the challenges that this time brings. But for you two, what's the biggest opportunity that this new normal brings? Frances, what is your view on something like this? They always say that in times of crisis, there's always opportunity. But what do you see?
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of opportunities that are already emerging. The very first of them is the rapid deployment of technology into our workplaces or outside our workplaces. So there's organizations I'm working with who have really struggled to digitize and to go through this digital transformation and get people working more fluidly, more cloud-based. Has had to happen rapidly. And actually that's enabled some other conversations to take place around how people will work into the future. So for me, that would be the first one, is actually removing some of those barriers and challenges. And often organizations have been held back by processes and systems which are no longer fit for purpose. And so during this crisis, we've really been able to see how we can amplify conversations if we need to under urgency and get things sorted. So I think the other one around that right now, and I think for all businesses, is having a luxury of a little more time to have long format conversations with our customers. And this idea that if you think about the questions you would love to have with your customers, but you normally have these bite-sized interactions, that you can go much deeper and actually really understand some of the pressures they're under or opportunities you may have to be able to help better serve them, which will be now and into the future.
Fantastic. What about you, James? What's the opportunities you see for this next new normal?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that, for us, it's almost that old expression of, in times of crisis, you stay closer to your customers and, you try, you're not necessarily talking to them about particular tangible pieces of work. It's more about how they're actually responding and how they're doing as individuals, which I think is a very rich conversation. I think one of the great opportunities has been a strange one, which is how we've all got to know each other a lot better as individuals as well. So, I mean, do you remember, I don't know, but, I used to feel kind of self-conscious on a conference call from home when I was working from home in the old days. Hey, the kids have got to be quiet and everything's got to be perfect. I've had the most imperfect calls with clients and teams all around the world, and I've absolutely loved it. So, I've met children and pets, and I've flipped the camera around and shown them the view in New Zealand out the window. So I think we've all learned a little bit more about each other, and I think we've perhaps stripped away some of the layers about, what about us as leaders and us as individuals. And, that for me is a great opportunity, because if you think actually about, back to that impact versus effort, it's not necessarily about this way we present ourselves. It's actually the difference that we're able to make and seeing that whole person. And we've been talking for so long about we shouldn't all be working 9 to 5. Some people work better for 3 hours in the middle of the night and all these sort of things. We've had to do that. I mean, colleagues that I've got who've got very young children, there's no way they're getting much done in the day. They're having to do that at night, and that's just the reality. And we need to be understanding of that. So I think it's been a great leveler in some ways, which is quite interesting. And I think that's to be applauded, and let's try and keep that going.
Actually, we've had previous speakers who say that virtually sometimes you get more accessibility to the guy at the top, right? You actually don't have to, not go through a secretary, but there is, like Francis says, you've gotten rid of a lot of the layers that you used to have to go through, make an appointment, sit there and everything like that. But now you know where everybody is, and you can actually have that access and talk more. So I think maybe we've gotten, like you said, to know each other better, which is a good thing, which is definitely a good thing.
That's a great thing.
Okay, so moving on to sort of the next question that we're going to bring up on the slide is that you've talked about the importance of balance and well-being as leaders and how this is the key productivity. I mentioned at the beginning, right? You can't get the best out of your workers if they're worried all the time or they're stressed all the time. So how do you achieve this personally? And Francis, how do you do that?
Look, I think productivity is going to be measured very differently going forward, and well-being, I think, will become into the same conversations along with humanity in strategy altogether. And part of that will be transparency, which is how people have leaders and have managed this process will be remembered for a long time. So I think that those organizations, leaders, where there being full transparency about the fluidity of what's happening, that we don't have all the answers, that we are going to have to shift and pivot almost on a daily basis and allow for people's personal circumstances will be watched and observed by our teams. And actually on the other side of this, they're going to be looking very closely at us saying, actually, I liked what you did, or I didn't like what you did. And actually that will change the perception going forward. So I think we're actually on the stage right now as leaders in front of our teams. And the more authentic we can be and the more assuring we can be that we don't have all the answers, which is almost going against what we're told in leadership is always to find all the solutions, is actually saying this is, nobody planned for a pandemic. I haven't been in a single board meeting in the last 5 years when we've talked about every risk profile that we've talked about the world shutting down. And I think had we even talked about it, the person who raised that as a potential risk would have been laughed out of the room. And so I think this is the time where we have to be very honest about the fact that we don't have the template going forward, but we have the the actual ability to saying we're going to lead through this together, and actually we're going to learn as we go and actually pick up where we fall and carry on again.
What do you think about that in terms of that, James, for your side? You mentioned it a little bit in your discussion, but in your case, how do you achieve your balance personally as well?
Well, I think it's a work in progress. I would say for me, but I completely agree with Francis. We are on the stage more than ever, and there's that wonderful sort of concept that we're always being watched as leaders. They're watching. People will sort of observe our body language, or how tired we look, or our tone of voice, all sorts of different things that we don't even think about, and that has just been completely amplified in these times. If there's any sort of concerns, oh, they look a bit worried, why is that? And it could be all sorts of different things. My team are pretty good with me. I mean, when I come off this call, I'm going on to our weekly sort of sales strategy call, and they know if I've had a good day or a bad day. They know if I've taken a lunchtime walk or a lunchtime cycle, and they'll pick me up on that if I haven't done it. So I think it's trying to maintain that balance for me is really trying to, there's certain things that I know I will have a better day if I do. I know that I'm a very keen cyclist, and I like getting out and doing that. If I don't do that, I just know the day will be worse. There's no doubt about it. My team know that. I know if I don't feel I've spent enough time with my children today and had a good family dinner, then I'll just feel bad about that. And, what I've really tried to think about and try to instill this to my team is, it's very tempting just to work harder at the moment. It's very tempting and again, all of the research points to this. People working at home don't do less because they're out of sight of the office. They do more because they never actually go away from work. They're always at work. So how do we try and lead that example as leaders? Now, I get it right some days, and I get it particularly wrong some days as well. But I think being able to not take yourself too seriously about that's pretty important, and acknowledge if I've been a bit grumpy. I will say that to my team, and they will send me messages saying get out on your bike, or go. Oh, I had one the other night from, and I know she's on this call, our learning designer in KL. Aslina sent me a message saying go to sleep, James, and so it's just that as well. And I think again, if this helps strip away any sort of semblances of hierarchy and nonsense that we maybe had left in the world, what a great thing that is.
But here's my question to the both of you. How do you ensure that when things do go back to semi-normal, and I've asked this to several people over several days, is that we do not just go back to where we were before? Or is that because a lot of people feel that this pandemic means that it's impossible to go back to the way we were before? I'd like your insights on that. How do we even sort of make sure that we take the good lessons from this, the collapsed hierarchy, the ease with each other?
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I think that the sheer scale of this crisis affecting everyone is going to prevent any chance of things going back to the way they were. For the majority of people, they are imagining a different future. They're looking at a different economic future. They're looking at well-being and their families and that balance of work and life. There's such a thing. I think that there is going to be an absolute expectation that we learn from this experience. And I've also got a number of colleagues, both here and around the world, who have actually really enjoyed this experience because it's actually taught them to slow down and reflect and to learn and actually to have the ability to reimagine the road ahead. Now, if you get that at scale, and because we're all connected now, we haven't had a crisis globally where people have been so deeply connected with each other that they're able to do this on a daily basis, that they are hearing stories live, they are seeing examples of what people are changing in their lives. And I think that we're starting to see that amplification of kindness and gentleness and volunteering and support for each other. We are supporting our local businesses more than we were before. We're thinking about how we travel and consume, and the whole consumption model will change. As I think going forward, people will say, well, did I have enough savings? How was I impacted? Do I need to be more frugal? Do I need more time with my family? Because those moments are going to be precious forever. So I think if we start to layer all of the changes that we have happened in our lives in a beneficial way, if we go back into the workplace saying, well, we're back to where we were, there'll be a mass revolt back against from staff. I think to say, well, hang on, what didn't you learn? Have you not just gone through something? And surely we can do better this time around.
Okay. What about you,
make these
James?
changes.
Yeah, look, I agree. I think like when you go through any big experience together, you know, even if as teams you've gone on some fantastic, you know, away day experience and it's kind of stripped away layers and we had that amazing experience together and we got to know our leadership team like we'd never got to know them before. I think that changes things. And I think, you know, you keep referring back to that and you say, hey, you know, you might be like this now, but I remember what you were like on that weekend. And, you know, it just, you know, erodes those kind of edges a little bit, which I really like. I agree. I think that we will question, you know, whether we needed so much stuff, whether we needed so many things, whether we needed to do so many amazing experiences. Just the joy of being able to walk in our neighborhoods, and I was saying to someone today, won't it be so exciting when we actually go out for a coffee? I mean, that's a big thing for us in New Zealand, and you know that. Well, that's great. That's not a particularly massively extravagant thing. It's a very simple pleasure. We didn't probably used to think about it very much, but how exciting it'll be when we get to do that with friends again. So I think I agree with Francis. I think there will be a sort of a collective people power movement for this, which is even if you try to change it back, the people wouldn't accept it. So it's like, oh, we're all now we can work together and we're out of lockdown, out of MCO. It would be great to have everyone back in the office. I think the team will say, why? Yeah, I think we should gather a couple of times a week. I think I'd love that, but we should perhaps gather over food, or we should share, or we should do something in a different way. Why have we even got such a big office? And why are we working so hard to pay the rent on a big office? I don't get it. So I think there'll be some great questions emerging from this as well. And why am I working so many hours a day if the most important thing impactful thing I do for the business, I could do that for 4 hours a day? Would that be okay? Yeah, it would be. Oh, well, obviously I wouldn't have as much money. I don't need as much stuff because I actually want to spend more time with my family and I want to volunteer and I want to do it. So I think there's all sorts of different things that will happen. Not for everyone. Some will be just can't wait to go back to how it was. I love the routine. But I think the ability to be able to be flexible and move around it without being seen as some sort of progressive weird person that just wants to do it differently, I think that'll be very, very exciting. Just the conversations that will be possible, and I was saying to my children today, and they sort of roll their eyes because they're teenagers. You know, you'll be telling your children about these times, you know, in 2020, and they just go, yeah, right, Dad. But they will be. You know, this is a moment of history we're living through, and I think it would be such a shame if we squandered that opportunity.
Once in a generational event. I think a lot of people are putting it that way. One more question for us before we actually go on to the Q&A, because there's a lot of them. How do leaders learn from this crisis to better respond to changing expectations from stakeholders? Your stakeholders such as your consumers, your clients, their workforce, and on top of that, fuel greater innovation and creativity within their organization. What do you birth from all of this? Francis, your view.
So I think I'll start with the innovation and creativity, because I think that needs its special kind of calling card. In times of crisis, it's a great opportunity for people to think about invention, research, development. And actually, one of the things as a leader, I've made sure that some of my teams are quite idle or would be idle right now because the function of their job is not as easy to transfer into their home environment. And so what we've said to them is given them the freedom to choose whatever projects they want to be involved with creatively. And that could be a personal project, it could be an innovative one for the company, it could be reimagining some of our things that we do and do it differently. But actually, one of the things that time in a different environment gives you is different perspective. And so what I've really loved is I've seen some of my up and coming leaders have gone out of their normal circles to look for the diversity of thoughts and ideas so they can actually learn from others around how they can bring it back into the organization. So it's thinking about the customers differently, thinking about those key stakeholders, not through what they have assumed and seen for a long time, but actually taking it from much greater in-depth conversations with them. But also thinking about how do we find better ways of engagement or improving that relationship. So it goes back to my earlier point around having plenty of time on our hands if we choose to use it for conversations. And I think the other thing is we will see and learn is the need to collaborate and cooperate a lot more with people who perhaps we have seen before as competitors, or people who have got quite different views, but actually if we're in it together and we need to get scale or we need to have impact, we need to look across our industry and potentially adjacent industry to our day-to-day, what's going to help us on the other side, and thinking very closely around our workforces and how they are working through this time.
Okay. What about you, James?
Yeah, I think what it's taught us, and I love the example you said before, Francis, that, you know, if we never simulated this, and if someone had suggested it on one of our retreats, we'd go, oh, that's just crazy, that'll never happen. So it's taught us that anything's possible and anything could happen. And I think too often we've sort of seen innovation as kind of a nice thing to do when we've got a little bit of time, but actually we need to focus on clients at the moment, and how we can actually just design that into everything that we're doing. This is no longer a kind of luxury item. So the ability to rethink everything that we're doing is, I think, the best legacy from this crisis. And if in 2 years' time, when we start to maybe forget some bits of this, for us to be able to track back to it and go, no, because remember in 2020 when everything changed, right? That could happen every time again. And we're not out of this. We will see, these aftershocks that I described. We'll see different economies and countries coming in and out of this at different stages. This is our new normal and our next normal. And I think, the opportunity around innovation is exciting. The opportunity around change as well. But again, just the fact that nothing's off the table, I find that quite exciting. On a good day, I find that quite exciting. I should add, on a bad day, I find that absolutely terrifying. But there you go. I'm just giving you both sides.
Okay, that's good. So we're moving on to the Q&A, and we have a whole bunch of them, and a lot of them are for the both of you. The first, actually, and one of the earliest, is Albert Chiot, who's the chairman of Supermax. They're glove makers. They say that, and it's back to empathy, I suppose. As a result of the crisis, how do you balance empathy for staff and creditors with the need to make profits or money for shareholders? I think this is a question a lot of people are asking themselves, as some places either furlough, take pay cuts. How do you balance that in a way and make sure that people still want to come to work?
Well, I'm happy to make a start on that one. I think it's very tricky, and I think the answer comes down to transparency as much as you can be. This is in very simple terms the reality of what we do as a business. This is where we get our money from. This is why we're here. This is our core purpose, and this is what we're here to do and to serve. And this is what each of you can do to make a difference to that. Now, if you're not, or if we're finding it difficult to do that, it's a simple bit of maths. The numbers just don't make sense. If we're not able to work in the same way, if we don't have the same clients, don't have the same customers, we're not being paid in a timely way, it just doesn't work. And I think, the companies I've been working with a lot, that's actually been a really interesting, insightful piece of data just for teams and for customers to go, oh, that's how our whole business model works. Right. Okay. I didn't even think about it before. I just sort of thought we magically got paid and then we got paid as well. So I think that's sort of on one simple level. The very difficult thing, I think I alluded to it in one of my earlier answers, is how hard hitting do you be with those messages versus the empathy piece as well. Now, you can be empathetic about it, but not to an extent that if I don't really tell you the reality, we all suffer as a team as well. So I think it's trying to give that messaging, but also soften it in such a way. And what I would always like to know is, this is the reality of what we're in, but this is what you can do about it. So, I mean, that's where I go in my head. If there's a crisis, what action can I individually take to make it better? So I think if I was advising in that particular situation, it's, this is pretty difficult, but here's what each and every one of you can do to make that a little bit better right now. And here's what we need to be talking to our customers about as well.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think one of the shifts that we've seen is we've covered off a little bit this idea that in our workplaces we've been someone quite different than who we are in our home lives, and we haven't ever brought the two worlds together and collided. And we've sort of removed some of the ego, I think, that goes with the workplace of this is who I am, this is how I dress, this is the front that I put forward. Now that we've seen into people's lounges, their kids and their animals and the chaos, and I have to say you've just missed all the pot banging and things here, because at 7 o'clock is the call out for the frontline workers in my neighbourhood, so we've just missed that. So you would have heard it, but the reality is right now the decisions you're making will determine those relationships with those key people going forward. And so obviously you need to protect the business first and foremost, the sustainability of the business so that can move forward. But actually, if I'm looking across the organizations that I work with, there's quite a differing view of how people are processing this. Some are coming down to the letter of the law and actually taking a very sort of hard, staunch approach to things. And the pushback has been enormous. And actually, I think there is a real risk of doing long-term brand damage. Those that are going in and saying, look, we've been hit as well. We're having a pinch. Our staff have had to reduce their pay cuts. We've had to do various things internally to be able to make sure we're sustainable. We also sympathise, and maybe if you think of it in terms of those who also have property and maybe are landlords as well as business owners, that actually, what would you say to that person if you had to face them in 6 months? If you'd come down really hard right now, in 6 months we maybe they're in a better position and able to come back to you, would you be proud of that conversation that you had? And would that truly and typically be who you are in your home life? And would that be true to, or if you put forward too much of the work view that just because the book says or the law says this is what needs to happen? So I think it's that being comfortable bringing more of yourself and that authentic self forward and saying, am I proud of the conversations I've had or about to have?
Okay. It's all about honesty. I can summarize from that. It's just, like you said, authentic self. And you mentioned what do you call it, just Adna, about how she's been direct, but she's also been a guidance, and that's why it's a good role model. But in a supplement to that, there's another question here, and I don't know whether you can actually answer this, is that, yes, we know we need a balance between empathy, and we know we need a balance between financial sustainability, but does prioritizing one over the other help you get back to normalcy, or what feels like normalcy better? You know, which one is the better one to put more stock in? And that's from Ruds. Ruds, if you know, he asked pretty much the same question, but that part at the end was interesting to me.
Yeah, I think I can't really add anything to Francis's brilliant answer, because I actually think the concept of when you reflect on it later, would you be proud of that conversation? You know, I think that's just really powerful. You know, whatever you had to prioritize in that moment, whatever messaging you gave, would it be something that you would actually stand by and say, yeah, I really did the best I could as a leader and as a human at that particular point in time. I didn't, you know, mislead my team and say, hey, everything's going to be fine. But equally, I didn't, you know, give them that hard message all the time. You know, was I showing a balanced degree of empathy? And I think, you know, remember how I said it's about direction and inspiration. I think it's about, you know, empathy and the sort of financial reality. I think both of those things can happen in the same conversation if it's dressed in the right way.
And maybe if I could just add too, and this perhaps from a Malaysian context, looking at us, we might be thinking, gosh, New Zealand, we talk a lot about empathy and kindness and support, and we starting to look like a bit kumbaya sitting around campfires here. But actually, I think it's something we've actually learned in recent times more than ever. And if I look back to my role models in my earlier career, they were very much the hardcore dictatorial leaders and hierarchical and was so strong and you know, almost to the point of never really understanding what they were feeling because they were stoic. And I think what I've seen, not even necessarily a generational shift, but actually just over time where we face many crises. And here in New Zealand in the last 12 months, many of you be aware, we've had terrorism around the mosque. We've had a volcano that tragically killed a number of people. We've had across in Australia the impact of the bushfires in New Zealand and now the COVID crisis, all in 12 months. And I think the more you go through crises of whatever scale, and that's before you even look at personal crises and tragedies, the more you become humble about actually we're here for a nanosecond on this planet, and actually do we really want to keep following the forefathers of that sort of stoic leadership, or do we actually really want to become more human in our style? And so I think in New Zealand, we've given each other permission to be just a little bit softer in the way we lead. And so I'm hearing these great conversations that are shifting and people getting more comfortable in their own skin. Maybe this is, the way forward of leadership is actually quite different from perhaps the way we learned going through the ranks in the earlier parts of our careers.
There's a lot of working from home questions here that I noticed in the list. And one of them in particular is about how it's raised some interesting dynamics, pot banging and apparently somebody's pets aside. We've seen excellent managers struggling in delivering outcomes while operating from home, but they've been weaker managers excelling at home. Should your evaluation of talent change in this climate? And actually we've had two other attendees actually chime in, Grace Yap and Jalalu, who talked about how this working from home is not the norm. It was forced on by the MCO, but in an Asian society, is it sustainable in an Asian mindset? So the essential whole thing is, now do we have to basically, when we look at new talent, pick people who are okay working in an office or working from home? How do we value them change?
Can I maybe just jump in there, because it's something I really believe strongly on, is actually, I think you should be looking for people who are comfortable with change. And I suspect the people who are doing really well working from home are not necessarily those who have got the perfect home environment with, no children and the lovely big spaces and great food delivery. It's probably those who are comfortable in that process of adaptation. And what I've seen myself is some of the greatest leaders coming through my company are actually people who have had identified as potentially having great skill sets, but they've really come into their own because they're actually now under this problem-solving mode they need to be in. It's sort of like putting their hand up saying, I've got this, I can pick this one up. And they're doing things that some of the more traditional leaders who are sort of having almost a grief for what's been left behind, and they can't wait to get back to what we had before. And so I would say that we do need to look at them more in terms of that mindset, and James talked about it in terms of the growth mindset. Actually, are they comfortable with, hey, next week you need to work from home, and actually sometimes you need to go and work in the client's office, and there's going to be, maybe you're not going to have the same desk every day of the week. These things will be more fluid, and actually looking for those soft skills that are around that will be really important.
Okay. What about you, James?
Completely agree. I think it's about mindset. It's not about I prefer working at home, I don't prefer working at home, and it's about contribution and whatever you call it, whether it's this lovely sort of sense of being of service. We were doing some coaching online learning earlier today, so we were talking about a coach is always there to serve. It's going back to what I said before, it's impact, not effort. So whether you're working at home, remotely, wherever you are, what are you actually there to do? How do you contribute to the actual mission of the organization? How do you make a difference? Going back to that sort of role with purpose piece as well. And there'll be certain days when you really feel that you can make that difference best from being in your home environment, because there's other things going on, you want to focus, or you want to be around for when your kids come back, or whatever that is. Other times when I really get my energy from being around people. But I think we're looking for people who can actually make that choice for themselves as well. So that's that next layer on the change piece, is that we're not imposing on you that on a Monday you work at home and on Wednesday afternoon you do this. We're actually saying, look, this is kind of what you're here to deliver in all sorts of different senses. How you do it, when you do that, who you do that with, it's completely up to you. But just, do it well and make a difference for our customers. And, that's easier in some companies than others. I absolutely get that. But I think if you can have that mindset, you can apply it, exponentially wherever you are. So I think, definitely it's not as binary as we look for people who will prefer this or that. It's just we look for the right character, the right mindset, and it will mean that whatever the next crisis that's thrown at us, because sadly there probably will be one, they're fine with that as well. They can do that because they've got that right mindset.
We've got quite a lot of questions about leaders in particular. I think this is referring to James's presentation earlier. What's the one thing Esther Yap asked that you could learn from the great world leaders that was shown earlier in your slide into steering the future of the crisis? Because there are a lot, like you say, you Google it and there's literally just hundreds of thousands of millions of how to be a great leader, you know, but what can we learn from the people that you pulled up in your presentation as we steer through this crisis?
Okay, look, I think there's two things for me. I think a great leader, for me, the measure of a great leader is the conversations that they're having. Okay, and the conversations that they're having with their colleagues, with their teams, with their customers, with people way outside of their peer group, you know, different influencers and academics or you know, whatever. So I think that's one thing that we can learn from the great leaders. The other thing is that, you know, a great leader for me sees beyond the future, you know, sees beyond the current as well, and thinks, okay, I'm here to sort of answer the questions that no one's really asked yet. You know, so our great team members and our managers, they're really focused on what this means. I'm actually looking a little bit further ahead, and I'm shamelessly carving out some reflection time for myself, or some stimulation from talking to other people about what that future might look like as well. So, but you know, as I said when I sort of presented those pictures of those so-called great leaders from the past, don't be under any illusion that they were perfect in any way, because they were not. Yeah. And we could do a whole nother talk on the flip side of those leaders. But what they managed to do is create a bit of a change by looking beyond, you know, that the immediate crisis, which people would think was their job, to looking beyond what sat behind it.
Okay.
So,
and actually, just in terms of other forms of great leaders going back in time, I think we should also think about Indigenous culture around their point of view about intergenerational decision making. So not making views and decisions about the next 5 years, but starting at 50 years. What do you want to do that impacts the world in 50 years positively, 100 years, 500 years? And I know in the New Zealand culture, it's the Māori culture, which is very much focused on that, and actually saying, what can we learn from the past to bring to the current time and take to the future? So we should make sure we don't throw away what we do know from the past and learn from it, but we also need to make sure we're always focused forward and thinking about the world we're going to leave for our grandchildren, but also, you know, multiple generations ahead.
Fiza Muhammad asks, actually, the two of you, I think as leaders, we should cultivate a sense of excitement to adapt to the new norms and organizations, rather than being crippled or paralyzed by this fear of change, as the outcome of COVID-19 is still uncertain or up in the air up until we get a viable way of dealing with it. Would you both agree on this?
Look, I would absolutely agree, and I've almost felt a bit uncomfortable about it, to be honest, because, you know, there's so many amazing things that we've been able to do just in our company to adapt very quickly. Very fortunate to have that sort of mindset within our team. But let's be quite clear about it. You know, we're facing a global crisis in which people are losing their lives. So I think, you know, there's that kind of balance as well about, hey, you know, there's some really great things that we're able to do here with the future of work, and we're able to adapt as a team. But it's a tragedy that we're facing globally, and will impact potentially members of our team or their families and all those sort of things as well. So, yeah, I think it is a balance. But I mean, you know, I have moments where I sort of long for the simplicity of ways we were doing things as well. But on balance, I think it's actually quite an exciting opportunity. Putting aside the reason that it's happened for one moment, which I think is very difficult, the possibility it creates, and I think the possibility it creates to do more good out of this is where we should be focusing.
Okay. Zakwan Ahmad from EPF Malaysia actually has this question, talking about, okay, this has come up also before in certain other cases, about leaders communicating effectively. We've talked about that, right? Breaking down barriers, making sure you're available. But there is always this one question. Some staff could be taking advantage of the situation. It's unfair to those who are actually working very hard. How do you cope as a leader with this kind of issue? Because I'm sure it does, whether you work from home or you work in the office, there will always be that. You mentioned, James, some people will come in, sit at their desk, but are they really working to the maximum capacity? As a leader, how do you deal and suss out with this kind of problem?
So I think when you move to more remote teams, or where you're distributed across, and some are in the office and some are not, you typically work on projects, and people are actually accountable to a team of people. It's very seldom that someone works entirely in isolation. And so what I have found, when I first, probably 10 years ago, struggled with this very concept of how would I know that people were really truly contributing the full capacity, actually the accountability is to their peers. Because actually, if you're looking around projects and the ability to get things done, if there's a weak link, it becomes very apparent. Because if you're, particularly if you're using cloud-based tools like a Trello board or maybe whatever you choose. I mean, there's a million different software that you might have. And actually the accountability is much more clear, because I think most people have this very sense of self-commitment and pride that goes with helping their teams. And so when it comes down to it, projects, if they slip because of an individual, that will shake up pretty quickly. And actually I have found, and to the point that James raised, when people work remotely and they have that flexibility in the way they work, are so thankful for that flexibility, and that maybe it's the acknowledgement that they've got kids or parents at home, they need care, or just health issues or whatever it might be. The actual level of commitment you get is significantly more than the person who sits in the corner and you wonder what they're doing in their office, because you literally have no way of, even within an office environment, really having that true accountability of what people are doing. So I think we've just got to get beyond that idea that at home means not working, at work means work. The two are it just doesn't pan out that way.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's just two or three things I'll add to that. When I first started my first job 25 years ago in London, on my induction, I was taught that, it's okay to go home before the boss, but leave your jacket on the back of the chair and leave your computer switched on, right? And I'm sure we'll not remember this. And it was this illusion of effort, rather than impact. And I think the people who say, well, how do I know if my team are working when they're at home? How do you know if they're working if they're in the office? What are they doing sitting at their desk when they're talking? What are they talking about? And I think it's really going back to accountability and impact. And again, if I just use an example of two or three of my colleagues, I think some of the most efficient team members I've ever seen are people who are balancing careers and being a mum. And they have to go it's 5 to 3. I got to go because I got to pick my kids up. And you see an amazing, incredible amount of efficiency and collaboration, particularly in that last hour or two before they've got to disappear, than you see in a lot of workers who are there for probably twice as long. And so again, who's making the most impact? Who's making the most impact on the organization? That's the question.
Sorry, James. There is a wonderful quote, and maybe some of you have heard it, which is the same thing around, what if I invest in people and train them up and they leave? And the flip side is, what if you don't and they stay? So, this idea of, good people, you want to invest in them. And actually what you don't want is an idle person doing nothing at all. So, people who are motivated and given opportunity within organizations will thrive. So it's making people finding what makes them thrive.
Yeah.
Following on, continue. Yeah, sorry, James.
No, and I was just going to say that unfortunately what it comes back to, and none of us like this, is that there are some difficult conversations there. So, we've got onto a sort of, this is a performance management issue, isn't it? Where there are people are contributing, and, eventually as leaders, we have to take a deep breath and have that conversation, whether it's the team that's exposed that and said they're not contributing, or wherever they were working, at home or in the office. That comes down to clear accountability, impact, and then a tough conversation sometimes as well.
I think that's the hardest part, because nobody likes those, right? But I love what Francis said, that how do you want to be remembered when this is all over? Are you going to be proud of that conversation that you have with that person at the end? I think, like you said, it's very powerful. Following on from that, though, Amina Josetta Kayani is asking, I think, something quite pertinent. It's not all, sometimes we think that, oh, maybe working from home means you're not working. But the truth is, some people are just not adept to working from home. They miss social contact. They miss having somebody to bounce ideas off. So how do you keep up the morale of those who are not used to working from home, who have to, balance a pet, a dog, grandparents and all that? So how do you as a team member help those guys who probably find the adjustment a bit harder so that you're all on the same page?
I think it's really important to remember this is not a permanent state. And there will be some people who will find this very hard because of their home situation. Or it could be they've lost people in their family, they've lost loved ones, or they're facing unemployment, or their partners are. And I think that if we have to have this sort of two horizons, the horizon which is let's get to the point where we get back to where we can make our own decisions. And I know I'm really excited about the idea that when I get back to the workplace, we've actually just before lockdown, we're actually in the process of moving to our new flagship location. So we're actually moving into a new place when we get out of lockdown. But actually, I'm very excited about this idea of making what would make work more livable, not just what makes life more livable. And so the first off the rank, the people who have said to me, as soon as lockdown is over, can I please come back to the office, are typically people who have not enjoyed this experience at all. And actually, what I've said to them from a social health, not just a mental health, just a socialization, let's prioritize those people and recognize some people have found this to be extraordinarily difficult because of either the crowding or just the number of personalities in a home, or isolation because they live alone. And so because it's a trusted environment as well, people have been very quick to put their hand up and said, this hasn't worked for me. And I think we can't punish those people because we didn't have planning in it. They didn't have any chance to have an alternative option. So there will be those who we have to give a long kind of flexible kind of response to this, but try to bring them back into what would that make them feel more comfortable, which might be a more regular work environment. And they'll be part of the core team who probably do turn up in the office on a regular basis and maybe back to a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, because that's the way they like to work.
Mm. I would completely agree, and I think the world needs those people, and actually, you know, I'll give you a confession here. I miss the routine of cycling down into Wellington to the office and having that time and seeing people, and then cycling home and having that sort of disengagement from the workplace to home, and rarely working at home. You know, it's not something I would choose to do. I'd rather stay at the office longer, and then when I'm home and I'm very present. So I don't actually like some of this sort of blurring at the moment. So I'm probably in that camp a little bit as well. And I think, you know, what we need to do as compassionate, empathetic leaders is realize that neither of those approaches is right or wrong. They just are. So the people who choose, who actually love coming to the office, that's great. The people who say, this is brilliant, I'm always going to work at home. Yeah, well, that's good too. But actually, we still want to see you sometimes because we actually want to collaborate together because we like to do that. But what I found very interesting at the beginning of MCO, obviously I have a lot of connections on LinkedIn in Malaysia, there was a lot of posts at the beginning of MCO about how people were finding it and keeping their diary, and I was quite struck by how much of a challenge it was in Malaysia for people who hadn't done it before. And I suppose we were quite used to doing it. I'd done it quite a few times. And I saw probably after the first week of MCO, even the people who were finding it quite exciting at the beginning were now saying, actually, I'm a bit lonely. I'm a bit isolated. I don't like it. I used to get energy from my for having lunch with my colleagues or just chatting, or so all of those different things. Now you can replicate some things in fun team catch-ups and Zoom calls where we're all going to bring our pet onto the call, or we're all going to wear a silly hat, and we can do that for a bit. But I think it's the sort of chance encounters that we miss as well. You know, we can't script a great conversation that we had in the elevator with a colleague who we just happened to bump into. It just happened. So I think that stuff, you know, we need to find a way of doing that again. But yeah, recognizing that a colleague that says this wasn't for them doesn't mean that they're not progressive or they're not, you know, about the future of work. They just have a different, you know, set of needs, and that's absolutely fine. And all of them are incredibly important to how we contribute, provided that they do make that contribution and impact as well.
I think that's a fantastic note to kind of end things on, especially since we were talking a lot about empathy. Thank you so much. And a lot of our attendees have also thanked the both of you so much for your insights this afternoon. It has been extremely enlightening. Thank you again, James, and thank you again, Francis. So with that, we've come to the end of our Power Talk session for today. Thank you so much for everybody who participated and all the questions. We apologize. We had a whole list of them that we weren't able to accommodate everyone, but again, it's so much appreciated. But feel free to go to the chat box. There's a lot of interesting information there, especially if you want to talk about future programs. And there's been a number of discussions there too. As always, we'd love to hear from all of you as to your feedback. There's a survey link provided and there's a QR code provided if you want to give us feedback and what topics maybe you might be of interest in as well. There's an online program series coming up. Watch this space. Any more information on that, you can email development@icdm.com.my or visit icdm.com.my. Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much, Francis. This has been a very, very enlightening afternoon. Tomorrow, we will have another of our webinar series. And this one in particular, is a bit close to my heart. It's talking about the rising corporate risks of weaponized fake news from Ryan Lim, who's principal consultant and founding partner of QED Consulting Singapore. With that, I will leave you. Thank you so much for attending this afternoon. Everybody, be safe.